The dust in Broken Creek had a taste. It was the taste of failed corn, of creek beds cracked into mosaics of dried mud, of the fever that left the town's children with skin the color of old parchment. For 2 years, the sky had been a merciless, empty blue. Prayers had baked dry on the tongues of the faithful before they could rise past the church steeple. The town was dying, and a dying town will believe in anything that promises rain. Sarah Jane Coulter knew that taste better than anyone. It was in the bread her stepfather, Josiah, ate in silence. It was in the well water she drew each morning. Noticing the rope had to go a little deeper every time. At 16, she had already buried her father, a good man who knew how to read the land, and her mother, a woman who had withered like a cut flower after marrying Josiah. Now, Sarah was an island in a sea of hollow-eyed settlers, a Coulter by name but not by blood. That was the detail that mattered most. The decision came on a Sunday, not from the pulpit, but in the hushed, urgent whispers that followed the sermon. Deacon Morse and Thomas Webb, their faces carved from granite and piety, came to the small house at the edge of town. They did not look at Sarah. They spoke to Josiah, their voices low and steady, as if discussing the price of feed or the mending of a fence. They spoke of the land's anger. They spoke of the old stories, the ones the founding families brought with them over the mountains, tales of appeasement and blood for water. A sacrifice was needed to wash the curse away, a life untainted, pure, not of the founding bloodlines, so no true kin would be lost, a life like hers. Josiah did not protest. He just nodded, his gaze fixed on a crack in the floorboards. Sarah stood by the cold hearth, her hands clenched so tightly her fingernails bit into her palms. She felt their words not as a sentence, but as a simple, logical conclusion, like the answer to a grim arithmetic problem. She was the remainder, the part that could be discarded. She did not cry. She would not give them the satisfaction. When they left, the silence in the cabin was heavier than the heat outside. Josiah finally looked at her, his eyes bloodshot and pleading. He was a weak man, and she knew, with a clarity that felt ancient and cold, that his weakness was more dangerous than the elder's righteousness. They came for her as the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in shades of bruised purple and angry orange. It was not a mob. It was a quiet, orderly procession of men with grim mouths and downcast eyes. They were her neighbors, men who had watched her grow from a gangly child into a young woman. Now, they watched as Josiah brought out a length of rope. His hands fumbled as he led her to the waiting buckboard. He avoided her gaze, his breath coming in short, sour puffs, as he began to bind her wrists to the wagon side rail, his fingers rough against her skin. He leaned in close. The words were a ghost of a sound, meant only for her. "If you live till dawn," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp, "I will give you money, enough to get clear of this place, to go somewhere else." The promise was a shard of glass in the wound of his betrayal. It was not for her. It was for him, a pathetic attempt to buy his own salvation. Yet a tiny, defiant spark ignited in the cold darkness of her fear. Dawn. He had given her a timeline. He had given her something to fight for. She straightened her back and met his fleeting glance with a look of pure ice. He flinched and pulled the final knot tight. The rope bit into her skin, a fiery bracelet marking her as chattel. The ride to the edge of the forest was silent, save for the creak of the wagon wheels and the soft thud of the horses' hooves in the deep dust. The townspeople followed on foot, a somber parade moving toward the dark maw of the Pinna Woods. They kept their distance, their faces unreadable masks in the fading light. Sarah watched them, these people who had shared bread with her mother, who had nodded to her in the street. Now they were her executioners, marching to witness a murder they called salvation. They stopped in a small clearing where the pines stood like silent judges. In the center was a thick wooden post, stripped of its bark and set deep into the earth. It had been waiting. The air grew suddenly cooler here, thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. The sounds of the town faded, replaced by the whisper of the wind through the high branches and the distant call of a night bird. Thomas Webb, a man whose hands were usually gentle with livestock, stepped forward. He held a small, sharp knife. He took her arm, his grip impersonal and firm. Sarah did not struggle. She held her breath, focusing on the image of the rising sun, a blazing circle of gold in her mind. "This is to call them," he said, his voice flat. "The guardians of the forest." He made a swift, shallow cut across the palm of her left hand. The pain was sharp, a sudden searing heat. Blood, dark and thick in the twilight, welled up instantly. It traced a path down her wrist, a single crimson tear. The metallic scent rose in the cold air, an invitation. They untied her from the wagon and dragged her to the post. The rough wood scraped against her back as they lashed her to it, pulling the rope so tight she could barely draw a full breath. They were efficient, thorough. They checked the knots one last time. Then they turned and walked away. Deacon Morse, Josiah, Thomas Webb, all of them. They did not run. They simply walked back toward the faint, dying glow of Broken Creek, their shoulders hunched. They did not look back. Their footsteps grew fainter and fainter, swallowed by the encroaching night, until there was nothing but the sound of her own ragged breathing and the steady, quiet drip of her blood onto the pine needles below. She was alone, utterly, completely alone. The last sliver of the sun vanished behind the jagged peaks of the mountains, and the world dissolved into shades of gray and black. The cold began to seep into her bones, a deep, invasive chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Fear, raw and primal, coiled in her stomach. It was a living thing, with claws and teeth. It told her to scream, to sob, to beg for a mercy that was miles away, sleeping in a warm bed. But another voice, quieter and harder, rose to meet it. It was the voice of her father, the memory of his pride. It was the voice of her own stubborn heart. "I will not scream for them to hear. I will not let them have my tears." She lifted her chin, staring into the impenetrable darkness of the woods. The wind soughed through the pines, a long, mournful sigh. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt through her. The forest was waking up. She could feel its ancient, hungry presence all around her. The scent of her own blood was a beacon in the dark, a dinner bell rung in the heart of bear country. She closed her eyes, not in surrender, but in focus. She had a promise to keep to herself. She had to live until dawn. The hours bled into one another, each one a small lifetime of cold and terror. Sarah Jane fought to stay awake, knowing that sleep was a predator as patient as any other. She fixed her eyes on the eastern horizon, a line she could not see but could feel in her bones, and waited for the first hint of gray. The forest was a symphony of unseen movements. A branch would snap, and her heart would hammer against her ribs. The wind would whisper, and it would sound like a low growl. Her own blood, drying sticky and dark on her palm, was a constant, terrifying perfume. Then, the sound changed. It was not the snap of a twig, but the heavy, deliberate crush of undergrowth. It was a sound with weight and purpose. A low huff of breath drifted through the trees, an exhalation of immense power. From the deepest blackness, a shape emerged, a shadow darker than the night itself. It was huge, a rolling mountain of muscle and fur, the bear. It paused at the edge of the clearing, its massive head swinging low to the ground, sniffing the air, its small, dark eyes fixed on her. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. A knot of ice. This was it, the beast her people had summoned. It took a step forward, then another, its movement slow, almost ponderous, a creature with no need for haste. It knew she was not going anywhere. It raised its head, and she could smell the wild, musky scent of it, the odor of damp earth and raw power. Her mind went white with a fear so pure it was almost calm. As the bear shuffled closer, its shadow swallowing what little moonlight filtered through the canopy, there was a sound, a sharp, clean slice through the air. A sudden thwump. An arrow, fletched with dark feathers, quivered in the dirt not 5 feet in front of her, precisely between her and the bear. The great beast stopped. It let out a confused grunt, shaking its head as if to dislodge a pesky fly. It looked at the arrow, then back at Sarah, its animal mind struggling to process this new element. Before it could decide, another sound came from the darkness behind it. It was not a word. It was a short, guttural call, a command that was part bird cry and part bark. It was a sound that belonged to the forest, and the bear understood it. The animal hesitated, its massive shoulders bunching. It looked toward the source of the sound, then back at the girl tied to the post, with another low, rumbling growl, a sound more of frustration than aggression. It turned and lumbered back into the woods, vanishing as silently as it had appeared. The silence that followed was more profound than any before it. Sarah's lungs burned as she finally took a breath. Her body trembled uncontrollably. From the same darkness that had produced the bear, a man appeared. He moved with a liquid grace, not a single twig snapping under his feet. He was tall and lean, dressed in buckskin that seemed to meld with the shadows. His black hair was long, hanging loose over his shoulders. His face was stark and unreadable in the gloom, all sharp angles and deep-set eyes. He carried a bow in one hand, a Comanche. He walked into the clearing and, without a word, pulled a second arrow from the quiver on his back and pushed it firmly into the ground next to the first one, reinforcing the invisible line that had just been drawn between life and death. He then approached her, his steps measured and calm. He did not look at her as an enemy, or a prize, or even as a woman. He looked at her the way a man might look at a trapped fox, with a kind of detached, practical pity. He drew a knife from his belt, the blade gleaming faintly. For a wild second, she thought her fate had only been delayed, but he went behind the post and with 2 swift, efficient motions, sawed through the ropes binding her wrists. The release was so sudden her legs gave way and she crumpled to the ground. He made no move to catch her, but he stood over her, a silent guardian, until the shaking subsided. A thought, clear and sharp as a shard of ice, formed in her mind. At 16 she was still innocent, left as bait for bears, until a Comanche warrior saved her. The man knelt, keeping a respectful distance. He offered a small water skin. Her hands were too numb to take it, so he held it to her lips, tilting it gently. The water was cool and clean, and it felt like a blessing. After she had drunk, he reached into a small pouch at his belt and took out a pinch of a dark, fragrant powder. He gestured toward her injured hand. Hesitantly, she held it out. He sprinkled the coarse herbal mixture onto the cut. It stung for a moment. Then a strange, numbing warmth spread through her palm, and the bleeding stopped. He rose to his full height, his gaze sweeping the forest around them. He seemed to listen to things she could not hear, to see things she could not see. He then looked down at her and made a simple gesture with his hand, a small jerk of his head toward the deep woods. Follow. There was no other choice. To stay was to die. To go back to Broken Creek was to die. This silent stranger was her only chance. Pushing herself up on unsteady legs, her whole body aching from the cold and the strain, Sarah Jane took a step, and then another, following the warrior into the heart of the forest. He moved quickly but not carelessly, weaving a path through the dense undergrowth. She stumbled behind him, her town shoes useless on the uneven ground. The night was a labyrinth of tangled roots and low-hanging branches. He seemed to navigate it by instinct, his senses attuned to the world around them. Several times he stopped, holding up a hand for silence, his head cocked. After a long moment, He would continue, changing their direction slightly. He was avoiding things she was glad she could not see, after what felt like miles. He led her to a small, sheltered overhang of rock. Here, he built a fire. It was not a settler's fire, a big crackling blaze that shouted its presence to the world. It was a small, nearly smokeless nest of embers that gave off a surprising amount of heat. He worked with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing. Every action had a purpose. There was no wasted energy. They sat on opposite sides of the small fire, the flames dancing between them. The silence was not awkward. It was full. It was the silence of two people who had just shared a brush with death. Sarah huddled closer to the warmth, her torn dress offering little protection from the cold. She watched him, this man who had saved her. He was cleaning his arrows, his long fingers moving with practiced skill. He had not spoken a single word to her. He had not asked her name, nor offered his own. He had simply acted. He must have noticed her shivering, because he rose and went to a pack she had not seen before, hidden in the shadows. He pulled out a heavy robe made of some thick, soft fur. He did not hand it to her. He laid it gently on the rock beside her. It was a simple gesture, but it was the first act of human kindness she had received all day. She pulled the robe around her shoulders. It was heavy and smelled of wood smoke, leather, and something else, something wild and clean. The warmth was immediate, a profound comfort that went deeper than her skin. It was the warmth of another living soul. She must have drifted off, lulled by the heat and the sheer exhaustion of it all. When she awoke, the fire was low and the man was gone. Panic seized her. He had left her, but then she saw him, standing at the edge of their small camp, a silhouette against the star-dusted sky. He was looking east, toward the mountains, waiting, just as she had been, for the dawn. But he was not waiting for it as a finish line. He was waiting for it as a beginning. He was waiting for the light so they could continue their journey, a journey she knew nothing about, to a place she could not imagine. He was a mystery, a silent warrior named Gray Eagle. Though she did not know it yet, a man who had lost his own world and had just stepped in to save her from the ruins of hers. Dawn did not bring warmth. It brought a pale, unforgiving light that revealed the true harshness of the landscape. The pines gave way to a steep, rocky incline, and soon the ground was dusted with old, stubborn patches of snow. They were climbing, moving higher into the mountains, and the air grew thin and sharp, stinging Sarah's lungs with every breath. The man, her silent savior, moved ahead of her with an tireless, ground-eating gait. He seemed to be a part of the mountain itself, his buckskin clothing the color of the rock, his movements as steady as the slow creep of a glacier. Sarah's shoes, made for the dusty, flat streets of Broken Creek, were coming apart. The leather was soaked through, and the thin soles offered no protection from the sharp stones hidden beneath the snow. A searing pain shot up from her left foot, and she stumbled, crying out before she could stifle the sound. He stopped instantly and turned, his dark eyes missing nothing. He looked down at her feet, then at her face, and his expression, for the first time, softened with something that might have been understanding. He led her to a cluster of boulders that offered some shelter from the wind that swept down the pass. He gestured for her to sit, and then he knelt before her, gently. He took her foot in his hand. The touch was impersonal, like that of a man tending a lame horse. Yet it was the most tender contact she had known in years. He carefully removed the ruined shoe. Her sock was torn and bloody. The sole of her foot was a mess of cuts and deep, angry blisters. He worked without a word. From a leather pouch, he produced a small pot made from a hollowed-out piece of wood. It contained a greenish, pungent salve. With his fingers, he carefully spread the cool, waxy ointment over her raw skin. The relief was immediate, a blessed numbness that replaced the fire. Then, from his pack, he took 2 pieces of soft, pliable deerskin and a thin leather thong. He wrapped the deerskin around her foot, creating a makeshift moccasin, and tied it securely at the ankle. He repeated the process with her other foot. When he was finished, he looked up at her. He pointed to his own chest, taking a slow, deep breath that made his ribs expand, and then exhaled just as slowly. He did it again, tapping his chest, encouraging her to mimic him. She followed his lead, drawing the cold air deep into her lungs and letting it out in a controlled stream. A rhythm. In, out, in, out. It steadied her racing heart. It gave her something to focus on besides the pain and the fear. He was teaching her how to breathe, how to survive in this new, brutal world. He then pointed to a trickle of water melting from an icicle high on the rocks and splashing onto a clean, flat stone. He drank from his cupped hand first, then nodded for her to do the same. The water was so cold it made her teeth ache, but it was the purest, sweetest thing she had ever tasted. They continued their ascent, Sarah's new deerskin coverings providing a surprising amount of comfort and grip. The rhythm of her breathing became a silent chant, a prayer for endurance. The world was stripped down to its barest essentials, the crunch of their steps in the snow, the burn in her legs, the steady back of the man in front of her. It was nearly midday when he suddenly stopped, holding a hand up and pressing himself flat against a wall of rock. He pulled her down beside him, his grip on her arm firm and urgent. He put a finger to his lips. For a long moment, she heard nothing but the whine of the wind. Then, below them, on the trail they had just climbed, came another sound, the clatter of shod hooves on stone, the jingle of bridles, the low murmur of men's voices. He pushed her toward a deep, narrow fissure in the rock face, a space barely wide enough for one person. She squeezed inside, the cold stone pressing against her back and chest. He flattened himself against the opening, becoming one with the shadows, his bow held ready but low, out of sight. The riders came into view. There were 4 of them, hunched against the cold, their horses picking their way carefully up the treacherous path. From her hiding place, Sarah could see their faces clearly. One of them was Thomas Webb. His face was pinched and gray, his eyes scanning the empty slopes. They were not a rescue party. They were a search party. They were looking for a body, looking for proof that their grim ritual had been successful, that the bears had come, that the curse was lifted. They were looking to confirm her death. A cold dread, far deeper than the mountain chill, settled over her. Josiah's promise of money if she lived until dawn had been a lie. He had never expected her to live. They had never expected her to live. She was meant to be gone, a ghost to appease an angry land. The riders passed their hiding spot without a second glance, their voices carrying on the thin air. They spoke of the cold, of the foolishness of the errand. They were convinced the wolves or the bears had already finished the job. Soon, their voices faded as they continued up the pass, and the only sound was the wind once more. The warrior waited a long time, his body utterly still, until he was certain they were gone. He relaxed his stance and turned to her, helping her out of the narrow crevice. He looked at her, and she knew that he understood. He knew what she had just seen, and he knew what it meant. There was no going back. The town of Broken Creek had not just cast her out. It had erased her. They traveled for another few hours, descending from the high pass into a sheltered valley where the wind lost its edge and the sun felt almost warm. Here, tucked into a grove of aspens, was his camp. It was a simple place, clearly temporary. 2 strong-looking horses were tethered, placidly chewing on sparse winter grass. A small fire of glowing coals was banked in a shallow pit, giving off a steady, smokeless heat. It was a place of solitude, of self-sufficiency. He motioned for her to sit by the fire and gave her a strip of dried meat. It was tough and salty, but it was food, and she ate it gratefully. He tended to the horses, his movements calm and gentle, speaking to them in a low, soft language she did not understand. When he was done, he came and sat across the small fire from her. For the first time since he had appeared in the clearing, he spoke to her. His voice was low and resonant, the English words spoken carefully, as if they were unfamiliar objects in his mouth. "My name is Kwahu Hot." The words hung in the still air between them. A name. He was not just a warrior, a shadow. He was a person. She found her own voice, surprised at its hoarseness. "I am Sarah Jane." He gave a slow, single nod, as if filing the information away. He picked up a stick and, in the bare dirt between them, he began to draw. He drew a line of jagged peaks, the mountains they had just crossed. He drew a wide, curving shape below it, the valley they were in. And then, far off to one side, beyond another set of smaller hills, he drew a series of circles. In the center of each circle, he drew 3 small lines, like the poles of a lodge. He pointed to the mountains, then to the valley. He pointed to himself, and then to her. Then he pointed to the circles, to the cluster of lodges, his people. He did not ask her to come. He did not offer her promises of safety or welcome. He simply showed her the map of his world, a direction. It was a choice. She could stay here and perish, or she could follow him into this unknown world. The question she had been holding at bay rose up with overwhelming force. "Who am I? I'm not Sarah Jane Coulter of Broken Creek anymore. That person is gone, hunted by the very people who gave her that name. Who do I belong to? Not to Josiah. Not to that town. I belong to no one." For the first time, that thought did not feel like a loss. It felt like a release. If she belonged to no one, then she belonged to herself. Her life was her own, bought with a night of terror and a stranger's mercy. Freedom was not a place. It was not a promise. It was this. It was a cold trail leading away from everything she had ever known. It was a choice, made in the dirt with a pointed stick. She looked at Kwahu Hot, at his stoic, patient face. She looked at the simple map he had drawn, a map to a new life, or a different kind of death, but it was a path forward. She met his gaze and gave a single, firm nod. Then she spoke the words that sealed her past and opened her future. "I will go with you." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he reached out with a stick and wiped the map from the earth, leaving only the smooth, unmarked dirt. The choice had been made. There was no need for a map anymore. There was only the journey. The journey lasted another 2 days. They moved out of the high, cold country and into a series of rolling, grass-covered hills dotted with stands of oak and cottonwood. Kwahu Hot rode one of the horses, a lean, powerful animal, while he had Sarah ride the other. He had given her a piece of jerky in the morning, and they had stopped only once to drink from a stream. He was a man of immense patience and silence, and she found herself absorbing his stillness, learning to watch the land the way he did, to notice the flick of a rabbit's ear in the tall grass, the circle of a hawk high overhead. Late in the afternoon of the second day, he crested a low rise and reined in his horse, waiting for her to come alongside him. He pointed down into the broad, protected valley below, and there it was, his village. It was nothing like Broken Creek. There were no rigid square buildings, no straight, dusty street. The camp was a living thing, a collection of more than 24 conical lodges made of tanned buffalo hide, arranged in a great, sweeping circle. Thin ribbons of smoke curled from the tops of the lodges, rising lazily into the clear afternoon air. Carrying the scent of wood smoke and roasting meat, dogs barked a welcome, and a group of small, naked children stopped their game to stare, their dark eyes wide with curiosity. Women looked up from their work, their hands stilling as they scraped hides or mended clothing. It was a place of life, of community. And Sarah felt a pang of something she could not name. It was a longing for a home she had never had, mixed with the sharp, cold knowledge that she was an intruder here. Kwahu Hot led her into the village, his face as impassive as ever. He did not seem to pay any mind to the stares and whispers that followed them. He rode toward the largest lodge in the center of the circle and dismounted, then helped her down, his hand strong and steady on her waist for a brief moment. An older man emerged from the lodge. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face a web of deep lines that spoke of many hard winters and a great deal of thought. His long, gray-streaked hair was tied back with a simple leather thong. He wore an air of quiet authority like a cloak. This was Chief Ironpath. His gaze fell upon Sarah, and his eyes, though old, were sharp and missed nothing. They took in her tattered dress, her pale skin, the deerskin wrappings on her feet. He looked at her not with hostility, but with a deep, probing curiosity, as if she were a puzzle he needed to solve. He spoke to Kwahu-Hat in their own language, his voice a low rumble. Kwahu-Hat answered, his voice steady and clear, though Sarah could not understand the words. She understood the story he was telling. She could hear the grim finality in his tone as he described the post in the forest, the anger in his voice as he spoke of the town that would sacrifice a child for rain, the quiet pride as he recounted placing the arrows in the dirt. He told the story simply, without embellishment, letting the facts speak for themselves. As he spoke, a crowd gathered, a silent circle of observers. Their faces were a mixture of expressions. Some of the older women looked at her with something like pity. The warriors stood with their arms crossed, their face guarded and suspicious. Chief Ironpath listened to the entire story without interruption, his gaze never leaving Kwahu-Hat's face. When the telling was done, a heavy silence fell over the camp. The chief finally looked at Sarah. He spoke, and Kwahu-Hat translated. He asks why they chose you. I was not of their blood, Sarah said, her voice small but clear. My mother married into the town. I was an outsider. Kwahu-Hat translated her words. A ripple of understanding seemed to pass through some of the onlookers. They understood the harsh logic of bloodlines and belonging. But not all were convinced. A woman stepped forward from the crowd. She was lean and hard, her face a mask of old grief. Her eyes were like chips of black flint, and they fixed on Sarah with an unnerving intensity. She spoke, her voice sharp and brittle, each word a stone cast at Sarah. This is Stands in Storm, Kwahu-Hat said quietly, his gaze on the woman. She was the sister of my wife. He did not need to say more. The woman's pain was a palpable thing, a cold aura that surrounded her. She saw Sarah not as a refugee, but as a replacement, an unwelcome ghost in a place of sacred memory. Stands in Storm finished speaking and pointed a rigid finger at Sarah. She says you do not belong here, Kwahu-Hat translated, his voice flat. She says the white man's world is full of lies and sickness, and you have brought its shadow with you. Before Sarah could respond, another woman, younger and with a much gentler face, approached them. She carried a small clay pot that steamed with the rich aroma of stew. She offered it not to Sarah, but to Kwahu-Hat, speaking a few soft words to him. He nodded his thanks. The young woman, whose name was Gentle Rain, gave Sarah a brief, shy smile before melting back into the crowd. It was a small gesture, but in the face of Stands in Storm's open hostility, it felt like a lifeline. Chief Ironpath raised a hand, and the murmuring stopped. He spoke for a long time, his voice calm and measured. He was not just speaking to Kwahu-Hat, but to his whole community. It was a judgment. It was a ruling. When he was finished, Kwahu-Hat turned to Sarah. He says our law does not allow us to turn away one who is helpless and has been wronged, but our people are wary. You have seen what the settlers do. You will be given a chance. He paused, gathering the right words. There is a lodge, my old lodge. You may stay there, but you will not be a guest. You must learn our ways. You must work. You must show that your heart is true, and that you are not a spy for those who would harm us. You must earn your place. Trust, he said. The word heavy with meaning is not given here. It is made with your own 2 hands. He led her away from the center of the camp, away from the prying eyes, toward a lodge that stood a little apart from the others. It was well tended, but it had an air of stillness, of being unoccupied. He pushed aside the hide flap and motioned for her to enter. The inside was dim and cool. It was larger than she had expected, the space clean and ordered. Buffalo robes were piled neatly to one side. A small fire pit sat in the center, the ashes cold. What drew her eye was one of the central wooden poles that supported the structure, carved into the wood. Starting from about the height of her knee was a series of small, horizontal notches. Climbing up the pole, they were growth marks, the record of a child growing, season by season. Kwahu Hot followed her gaze, and for a fleeting moment, the stoic mask on his face cracked. A look of such profound, deep-seated pain passed through his eyes that Sarah had to look away. This was not just a lodge. This was a home he had shared with his wife and child, the family he had lost to the white man's sickness. To bring her here, to this place so filled with ghosts, was a sacrifice of its own. He had brought her into the heart of his own sorrow. He placed the pot of stew Gentle Rain had given them by the fire pit. "You will be safe here," he said, and then he turned and left, leaving her alone in the sudden, overwhelming silence. She sank down onto a buffalo robe, the weight of the last few days crashing down on her. She was alive. She was sheltered, but she was more alone than ever. She was a stranger in a strange land. Her survival depended on the goodwill of a people who had every reason to hate her. She looked at the marks on the pole, the silent testament to a life cut short, and understood the price of her own safety. It was paid for with the grief of the man who had saved her, and the suspicion of a woman who wished he had not. The opportunity she had been given was not a gift. It was a challenge. And as she dipped her fingers into the warm, savory stew, she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this was the test of her life. She would not fail. The days that followed were a blur of work, a long, aching lesson in a new kind of survival. Life in the Comanche camp was a constant, rhythmic cycle of tasks dictated by the sun and the seasons. And Sarah was thrown into it without ceremony. Gentle Rain became her patient, smiling teacher. She showed Sarah how to use a sharpened bone scraper to clean every last bit of flesh from a buffalo hide, a smelly, back-breaking job that left her muscles screaming. She taught her how to soak the hides in a mixture of water and animal brains until they were soft, then to stretch them on a wooden frame to dry in the sun, pulling and working the leather for hours until it was as pliable as cloth. Her hands, accustomed to darning socks and kneading dough, were not prepared for this. They blistered, the blisters broke, and the raw skin beneath bled. Every morning, she would wake in the cold lodge, the stinging in her palms a harsh reminder of her new reality. The women of the village watched her. Some, like Gentle Rain, offered quiet encouragement, a nod, a shared piece of roasted prairie turnip. Others, the friends of Stands in Storm, would turn their backs when she approached, their silence a wall of disapproval. And then there were the curious ones, who would simply stand and watch her toil, their faces unreadable, as if she were a strange new animal they were trying to understand. Sarah learned to stitch the tough leather using a sharpened awl and thread made from deer sinew. Her first stitches were clumsy and uneven, a child's scrawl across the hide, but she persisted, her fingers growing tougher, the movements less awkward. She learned to sort porcupine quills and tiny beads, her eyes aching from the strain of the fine work. She learned how to pound dried meat and berries with melted fat to make pemmican, a food that could last for months and was the lifeblood of the people during the long winters. With every task she mastered, no matter how small, she felt a flicker of pride. It was an exhausting, painful education, and her raw, blood-stained hands became the symbol of her tuition. They were her badge of entry, a testament written in her own flesh that she was trying Kwahu Hot was a constant, quiet presence. He did not live in the lodge with her. He had made a temporary shelter for himself on the edge of the camp, respecting her privacy and the memory of his family. But he was always there. He would leave a piece of fresh meat or a brace of rabbits outside her lodge flap in the mornings. He watched her work from a distance, his face revealing nothing. She felt his gaze on her often, a silent assessment that made her work even harder. She was not just working for her own survival. She was working to prove to him that his act of mercy had not been wasted. The children were the most direct. They were a small, fearless tribe, their curiosity unhindered by adult politics. At first, they kept their distance, whispering and pointing at the white woman with the strange hair and clumsy hands. Sarah tried to smile at them, but they would scatter like startled quail. One afternoon, as she was struggling to stretch a heavy hide, a group of them grew bolder. They circled her, their dark eyes watching her every move. One small boy, no older than 5, picked up a smooth, gray stone from the ground. He hefted it in his hand, his face a mixture of bravado and uncertainty. Then he threw it. The stone was not meant to injure. It was a test, a challenge. It landed softly in the dirt near her feet. Sarah stopped her work. She looked at the stone, then at the boy, who was watching her with wide, expectant eyes. All the other children fell silent. She could have grown angry. She could have shouted. She could have ignored it. Instead, she remembered the few Comanche words Gentle Rain had been teaching her. She bent down and picked up the small, smooth stone. She held it in her palm, turning it over. She looked at the boy and gave him a small, tired smile. "Pia," she said, "the word for good." "Ha," she added, "the word for thank you. Good stone. Thank you." Her accent was terrible, the sounds foreign and clumsy on her tongue. The effect was immediate. The children stared, utterly baffled. The boy who had thrown the stone looked at his friends in complete confusion. This was not the reaction they had expected. There was no anger, no tears, just a strange politeness. It was so unexpected that their game was ruined, one by one. Their shoulders slumped, and they shuffled away, their curiosity satisfied for the day. That evening, as Sarah sat rubbing tallow into her sore hands, Kwahu Hot appeared at her lodge entrance. He stood for a moment, watching her. "You passed the first test," he said, his English slow and deliberate. She looked up, confused. "What test?" "With the children," he explained. "To be shamed is a great wound. To be angry is a weakness. You kept your face, and you did not bring shame to the boy. You turned his stone into a gift. This is a difficult thing. It is a sign of a strong heart." His words were a balm on her raw spirit. It was the first praise she had received, the first acknowledgement that someone saw not just her struggle, but the person she was trying to be. It was a small thing, but it felt as solid and real as the calluses forming on her palms. A few days later, the bond between them deepened, not with words, but with work. Kwahu Hot returned from a hunt with a young buck slung over his horse. He began the work of skinning and butchering it himself, his movements economical and precise. It was a large animal, a difficult task for one person. Most of the other women were busy with their own tasks, and no one offered to help the solitary warrior. Sarah watched him for a while from her lodge. She watched his strong, sure hands with the knife, the way he worked with a deep respect for the animal that had given its life. And she remembered. She remembered her own father, a man who had known how to hunt and fish and live from the land. He had taught her many things, believing a daughter should be as capable as a son. He had taught her how to properly dress a kill. She wiped her hands, took a deep breath, and walked out of the lodge. She did not say a word. She went to where Kwahu Hot kept his tools and picked up a smaller, sharper skinning knife. He stopped his work and looked at her, his expression questioning. She did not try to explain. She simply knelt on the other side of the deer and began to work. Her hands found the familiar rhythm, separating hide from flesh, her knife moving with a confidence that surprised even herself. It was a skill from her old life, a piece of her past that was not useless here. Kwahu Hot watched her for a long moment, his eyes taking in the sureness of her movements. Then, without a word, he turned back to his own work. They worked together in a comfortable, efficient silence. The sun beat down on their backs, and the only sounds were the slice of their knives and the buzzing of flies. In that shared, bloody task, a new understanding was forged. It was a partnership born not of words or promises, but of mutual competence and a quiet, profound respect. He saw that she was more than a helpless victim, and she saw that he was more than a silent, stoic warrior. They were two people, survivors, who understood the hard, necessary work of staying alive. She felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. She was still an outsider, a woman caught between two shores. She was not of Broken Creek, and she was not truly Comanche. But for the first time, as she worked beside this man, under the vast, open sky, she did not feel entirely adrift. Her hands were raw and stained, but they were her own. And with them, she was slowly, painfully, building a life. The change came not with a whisper, but a roar. The sky, which had been a crisp, clear autumn blue, turned the color of a leaden bruise in the space of an afternoon. A deep, unnatural cold fell over the valley, and the wind began to howl. A low, mournful sound at first that steadily rose in pitch until it was a shrieking, malevolent thing. Then the snow came. It did not drift down in gentle flakes. It was driven horizontally. A blinding, stinging curtain of white that erased the world. For 3 days, the blizzard raged. The people of the village were prisoners in their own lodges, the wind tearing at the buffalo hides, the poles groaning under the strain. The world was reduced to the small, smoky circle of life within each home. Sarah kept the fire in Kwahu Hot's old lodge burning steadily, the small store of wood they had gathered dwindling at an alarming rate. The sound of the storm was a constant, physical presence, a monster trying to claw its way inside. It was impossible to tell day from night in the churning, white chaos. On the second night of the storm, as the wind screamed its loudest, Sarah heard something else. It was a sound so thin and high it was almost part of the wind's cry. A sound you felt more than heard. A child's cry. Faint, desperate. She strained to listen, telling herself it was just a trick of the wind, the cry of a mountain cat. Anything but what she feared it was. But she heard it again. A thread of human terror nearly ripped to shreds by the gale. She scrambled to the lodge flap and pushed it open a crack. The storm blasted in, a wave of ice and fury that stole her breath and plastered snow to her face. Out in the maelstrom, just for a second, she saw a flicker of movement near another lodge, a figure stumbling, falling. Then the whiteout swallowed everything again. At the same moment, the flap to stands in Storm's lodge was thrown open, and a woman's wail of pure anguish cut through the wind before being smothered by it. Kwahu Hot was there in an instant, appearing at her lodge entrance as if summoned by the cry itself. His face was a grim, determined mask. He did not need to ask what had happened. They both knew. A child was out there. "Little bird," he said, his voice a low growl against the storm. He was already pulling on a heavy buffalo robe, checking the ties on his winter moccasins. He was going out there, into that. It was suicide. A man could get lost 10 feet from his own lodge in a storm like this, wandering in circles until the cold took him. Panic seized Sarah for a moment, a cold fist clenching in her gut. But then her mind, sharpened by weeks of practical, life-or-death tasks, went to work. She could not stop him, but she could help him come back. "Wait," she commanded, her voice sharp with an authority that surprised them both. He paused, his hand on the lodge flap, and looked at her. She grabbed the longest, strongest rawhide rope she could find, one used for tethering the horses, working with frantic speed, her cold, numbed fingers fumbling with the knots. She tied one end securely to the main central pole of the lodge, the one carved with the growth marks of his lost child. She tested the knot, pulling with all her weight. It was solid. It was an anchor in the heart of the home. She pushed the other end of the rope into his hand. "Take this," she said, her voice urgent. "Do not let go of it. It will be your way back. It is a homeward thread." He looked at the rope, then at her. Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by a flicker of profound respect. It was a simple, brilliant idea. It was a lifeline. He gave her a single, sharp nod, his eyes locking with hers for a brief, intense moment. In that look, an entire conversation passed between them. Acknowledgement, trust, a shared purpose. Then he wrapped the rope around his wrist, pulled his robe tight, and plunged out into the screaming white hell. The lodge flap fell shut, and Sarah was alone with the howling wind and the pounding of her own heart. The rope, her fragile connection to the man out in the storm, lay stretched across the floor, disappearing into the blizzard. She could feel the faint, occasional tug on it as he fought his way through the drifts, and she prayed with a fervor she had not felt since she was a small child. But she did not just pray, she worked. Her fear was a cold stone in her belly, but she forced it down, channeling it into frantic, purposeful action. She piled wood onto the fire until it was a roaring blaze, a beacon of heat and light. She took several large, smooth river stones and placed them in the hot embers at the edge of the fire, turning them until they were almost glowing. She filled a pot with snow, melted it, and added handfuls of crushed pemmican and dried roots, putting it on to simmer into a thick, nourishing soup. She pulled the warmest, softest furs and robes and laid them out in a pile near the fire, creating a warm nest. She was preparing for a rescue. She was fighting the storm with the only weapons she had: fire, warmth, and a stubborn refusal to give in to despair. The hours crawled by. The rope was her only companion. Sometimes it would go slack, and a fresh wave of terror would wash over her. Had he fallen? Had he dropped it, then she would feel a faint tug, and she could breathe again. She sat by the fire, her hand resting on the taut line, as if she could send her own strength, her own hope, out into the storm through that thin strip of hide. It was long past midnight when the lodge flap was finally flung open. A blast of wind and snow roared in, and Kwahu hot half fell, half stumbled inside. He was a creature made of ice and snow, his robe and hair white with it, his face rimed with frost, and in his arms he carried a small, limp bundle, Little Bird. He laid the child down on the prepared furs near the fire. She was terrifyingly still. Her skin was a pale, bluish gray, her lips almost black. There was no sign of breath. Kwahu hot collapsed to his knees, his own strength spent. Sarah did not hesitate. She stripped the child's frozen, snow-caked clothes away. The small body was as cold as marble. Sarah grabbed one of the heated stones, wrapping it quickly in a piece of buckskin so it would not burn, and placed it near the child's feet. She did the same with another, placing it by the child's torso. Then she bent over the small, still face. She covered Little Bird's mouth with her own and breathed out, sending a stream of her own warm air into the child's icy lungs. She did it again and again, a steady, desperate rhythm. "Come on," she pleaded silently. "Breathe." Kwahu hot, recovering slightly, began to chafe the child's small, frozen limbs, trying to force life and warmth back into them. They worked together in a frantic, silent harmony, a desperate two-person army against death. For a long time, there was nothing. Then, just as despair began to creep back into Sarah's heart, the small chest beneath her hands gave a tiny, shuddering heave, a wisp of a cough, a faint, shallow breath. Oh. They worked for another hour, wrapping the child in warm robes, surrounding her with the heated stones, spooning tiny drops of the warm, rich soup into her mouth. Slowly, miraculously, the bluish tinge began to recede from the child's skin. The breathing grew stronger, deeper. Finally, Little Bird's eyelids fluttered open, her eyes dazed and confused. She was alive, exhausted and weak, but alive. Kwahu-Hat gently lifted his great niece and wrapped her in the warmest buffalo robe, holding her close to his own body, sharing his own returning warmth. The storm broke with the dawn, the wind died down, and a profound, muffled silence fell over the snow-choked valley. The world outside was a pristine, beautiful landscape of white, burying the memory of the night's violence. A short time later, the lodge flap was pushed aside. Stands in Storm stood there, her face a ravaged mask of grief. She had clearly been awake all night, imagining the worst. Her eyes were hollow, her shoulders slumped in defeat. She looked at Kwahu-Hat, her gaze filled with a terrible, unspoken question. He simply moved aside, revealing the small child nestled in the furs, sleeping peacefully, her breathing soft and regular, a healthy pink blush now on her cheeks. Stands in Storm stared, her mind unable to process what she was seeing. Her body began to tremble. A low, ragged sob escaped her lips. She stumbled forward and fell to her knees beside her great-grandchild, her hand hovering over the sleeping form, as if afraid to touch, afraid this was a dream. She gently touched Little Bird's hair, her cheek, assuring herself that she was real, that she was warm. Then she looked up at Sarah. Her hard, flinty eyes were filled with tears. All the bitterness, all the suspicion, all the old grief that had walled her off from the world, crumbled in that moment. She reached out and, with a hand that trembled, she touched Sarah's arm. Her hand was rough and calloused, but the touch was unbelievably soft. "You saved her," Stands in Storm whispered, the words thick with emotion. It was not a question. It was a statement, an admission, an acceptance. "Our child, you saved her." The news of the rescue, of the rope and the heated stones, spread through the village as quickly as the morning sun melted the snow on the lodges. The looks Sarah received were no longer suspicious or curious. They were filled with a new respect, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. That afternoon, Chief Ironpath came to her lodge. He looked at her with his wise, old eyes. "The heart of a community is not made of words," he said, Kwahu-Hat translating. "It is made of right actions at the right time. You have shown us the strength of your heart. Our children should know your ways, as you have learned ours. They must learn the white man's tongue. It is a weapon, and it is a bridge. We would have you be their teacher." Sarah looked from the chief to Kwahu-Hat, whose own eyes held a quiet, profound pride. She looked at the rope, still coiled by the central pole. It was more than a lifeline. It had been a thread connecting two worlds, and with it she had finally, irrevocably, pulled herself to shore. The seasons turned. The deep snows of the blizzard melted, feeding the creeks and turning the valley into a carpet of vibrant green. Sarah's life found a new rhythm, one of purpose and quiet satisfaction. Her days were spent with the children, their bright, curious minds a fertile ground for the strange new seeds of the English language. She taught them the names of animals, the words for sun and moon, and the simple songs her own mother had once sung to her. In return, they taught her their games, their stories, and their language, their laughter a constant, welcome music. Her hands, once soft and pale, were now tanned and calloused, strong and capable. Stands in Storm, her former adversary, now sought her out, sharing stories and teaching her the intricate patterns of their beadwork, their shared needlework, a silent language of acceptance. The peace was shattered on a warm afternoon when two Comanche scouts rode into the village at a gallop, their horses lathered and their faces grim. They went straight to the lodge of Chief Ironpath, and a tense silence fell over the camp. A short time later, Kwahu-Hat came to find Sarah. She was helping Gentle Rain stretch a small deer skin, and she knew from the look on his face that something was wrong. "Men have crossed the river," he said, his voice low and tight. White men, many of them, with rifles. A cold dread, a ghost of a feeling she had thought long buried, crept up her spine. How many? Maybe 20. Our scouts saw them making camp by the old cottonwoods. They saw Thomas Webb. And your stepfather. He paused, his dark eyes holding hers. There is another man with them, one they call Fletcher. He carries himself like a wolf. He is the leader. The names, Josiah and Thomas Webb, were echoes from another life, another world. To hear them now, spoken in this place that had become her sanctuary, felt like a violation. They had come for her. After all this time, after leaving her for dead, they had come. A council was held in the center of the village. The warriors were tense, their hands resting on their weapons. Some spoke of war, of driving the trespassers out with force. Chief Ironpath listened to them all, his weathered face impassive. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm but carrying the weight of command. "We will not be the first to shed blood," he said, his words translated for Sarah by a young warrior who had been her pupil. "To fight now is what this man Fletcher wants. We will meet them. We will talk. Quahu hot. You will go. You speak their tongue. You will tell them this is our land and they are not welcome." Quahu hot nodded, his face set like stone, but as he turned to prepare, Sarah stepped forward. "I will go with him," she said, her voice clear and steady, ringing out in the sudden silence. All eyes turned to her. Chief Ironpath raised an eyebrow. "This is warrior's business. Sarah Jane, it is too dangerous." "It is my business," she insisted, her gaze unwavering. "They have not come for your land. They have come for me. They think I am a prisoner." "If they see only warriors, they will see what they came to see. But if they see me, if they hear the truth from my own mouth, there may be a chance for peace. My presence is the only thing that might prevent a fight." A murmur went through the crowd. She was right. Her logic was undeniable. Quahu hot looked at her, a fierce pride burning in his eyes. He had seen her stand up to a child's thrown stone. Now she was ready to stand up to a man's rifle. Chief Ironpath considered her words for a long moment, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Your heart is strong," he said, "and your words have wisdom. You will go." They set out within the hour, a small delegation of peace. Quahu hot rode at the head, carrying not a weapon, but a long staff adorned with eagle feathers and a swatch of white deerskin, a clear symbol of his intent to talk, not fight. Sarah rode beside him, her back straight, her heart a wild drum against her ribs. She was no longer the terrified girl tied to a post. She was a woman of the people, riding to defend her chosen home. They found the settlers' camp in a clearing by the river, a circle of nervous energy and bristling steel. The men looked thin and ragged, their faces etched with the same desperation she remembered from Broken Creek. But there was a new hardness in their eyes, a cold fire stoked by the man who stood in their center. Fletcher was a tall, raw-boned man with a tangle of a beard and pale, cold eyes that seemed to see the world as something to be conquered or destroyed. He held a long rifle in the crook of his arm as if it were a part of his body. When he saw the Comanche delegation, a cruel smile twisted his lips. He barked an order, and his men raised their rifles, the series of clicks echoing ominously in the quiet afternoon. Thomas Webb looked pale and nervous. Josiah stood in the background, his face a mask of conflict, his eyes fixed on Sarah as if he were seeing a ghost. Quahu hot reined in his horse a safe distance away and raised the white banner high. He spoke in English, his voice calm and powerful, carrying easily across the clearing. "You are on our land. State your purpose." "Our purpose is to take back what's ours," Fletcher snarled. Stepping forward, he spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "We've come for the girl, the one you're holding captive." "She is not a captive," Quahu hot stated, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Liar," Fletcher sneered. Everyone knows you savages steal white women. We've come to bring her home and to teach you a lesson for trespassing on her soul." The air grew thick, heavy with the promise of violence. Sarah knew this was her moment. Before Kwahuhat could speak again, she urged her horse forward, moving to his side, placing herself in full view of the men from her past. "I am not a captive," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "No one is holding me here." Fletcher's eyes narrowed, his gaze raking over her Comanche dress, her braided hair. "They've twisted your mind, girl. Don't you worry. We'll get you away from them." He shifted his aim, the long black barrel of his rifle swinging to point directly at Kwahuhat's chest. "Now, send her over, or your warrior friend is the first to die." This was the precipice, the line between a tense talk and a bloody massacre. Without a second thought, Sarah slipped off her horse and walked into the space between the two armed camps. She walked until she stood directly in front of Fletcher's rifle, the cold, dark circle of the muzzle only a few feet from her own heart. She could smell the sour scent of the man, the gun oil, the stale sweat. "If you are going to shoot him," she said, her voice now as steady as the river, "you will have to shoot me first. I am here by choice. This is my home. These are my people." Fletcher stared at her, his cruel smile faltering in confusion. This was not the frightened, weeping captive he had expected. He hesitated, his finger tightening on the trigger. And then, the unthinkable happened. From the back of the group, Josiah Coulter stumbled forward. His face was ashen, his eyes wide with a terror that was stronger than his fear of Fletcher. He pushed past the other men and threw himself between Sarah and Fletcher's rifle, his arms flung wide as if to shield her. He was not looking at Fletcher. He was looking at Sarah, at the strong, brave woman his cowardice had almost destroyed. "No!" Josiah choked out, his voice a ragged sob. "Put it down, Fletcher! For the love of God, put the gun down!" Fletcher's face contorted with rage. "What are you doing, you old fool? Get out of the way!" "I said put it down," Josiah shrieked, his voice cracking with a lifetime of pent-up shame and a single, sudden moment of courage. He turned to the other men from Broken Creek. "She's right, can't you see? We left her to die, and she lived. We have no claim on her. We have no right. This is not justice. It is murder." His words, born of desperation and guilt, struck a chord with the other settlers. Their own faces were a mixture of confusion, shame, and doubt. They looked at Sarah, standing proud and unafraid. They looked at Josiah, his arms spread like a martyr. They looked at Fletcher, his face black with fury. The certainty that had driven them here began to crumble. One by one, their rifles lowered. Fletcher was alone. He was a wolf who had lost his pack. With a final, venomous curse, he spat on the ground, lowered his rifle, and stalked back to his horse, his authority broken. The standoff was over. The bloodline had been drawn not with bullets, but with a woman's choice and a weak man's final, desperate act of redemption. The men from Broken Creek retreated, a confused and defeated mob, following their disgraced leader. Josiah was the last to leave. He paused and looked at Sarah, his eyes pleading for a forgiveness he did not deserve. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a pardon. It was an ending, a closing of a door. He turned and followed the others, a man who had, for one brief moment, been better than he was. Kwahuhat came to stand beside her, and together they watched until the last of the riders had disappeared. The silence they left behind was vast and peaceful. That night, the village celebrated. There was drumming and singing and feasting. It was a celebration not of victory, but of peace. They were celebrating the courage that had turned away violence. Sarah was no longer the outsider, the white woman they had taken in. She was one of them. She was Sarah Jane of the people, a woman who had faced down her own past and chosen her own future, her place among them. earned first with bloody hands and then with a brave heart, was now secure, affirmed for all to see. The winter that followed the confrontation with Fletcher's men was a peaceful one, a time of healing. The story of Sarah's stand and of Josiah's desperate act of courage became a tale told around the fires on long, cold nights. She was no longer a subject of curiosity or suspicion. She was a part of the community's own story. 2 winters had now passed since the night she was tied to the post. The girl of 16 was gone, replaced by a young woman of 18, her body hardened by work, her spirit forged in fire and ice. Spring came to the valley in a rush of meltwater and bird song. The air grew soft, carrying the scent of damp earth and new leaves. The world felt fresh, washed clean of the past. It was in this season of renewal that the quiet space between Sarah and Kwahu began to change. The easy companionship they had forged in shared labor and danger deepened into something more profound, an unspoken tenderness that lingered in their shared glances. One evening, they sat together by the small fire inside the lodge that had once been his, and was now hers. The day's work was done. The children were asleep in their own homes, and a comfortable silence had settled between them. It was Kwahu who finally broke it, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "Before you came," he began, his English careful and measured, "this lodge was a tomb. I slept outside because the memories in here were too loud." He looked at the pole where the marks of his son's growth were carved, and this time, the pain in his eyes was mingled with a kind of sad peace. "I was a ghost. I hunted for the people. I fought for them. But I was not one of them. My spirit was wandering in the past, with my wife and my son." He turned his gaze to her, and the intensity in his dark eyes made her heart beat faster. "You changed that. Sarah Jane, I watched you work when your hands were bleeding. I saw you face the children's stones with kindness. I saw you tie a rope to my home so I would not be lost in the storm. I saw you stand before a rifle, ready to die for a choice you had made." He reached across the small fire and, for the first time, took her hand. His own was warm and rough, a hand that knew the feel of a bow, a knife, a horse's rein. It was a hand that had saved her life. "You were so full of life, so determined to live, that you made me want to live again. Too, not as a ghost, but as a man. You brought me back into the circle of my people. You brought me home." His words were a confession, a baring of his soul that left her breathless. All the unspoken things that had passed between them, all the shared dangers and quiet moments of understanding, were now laid bare in the flickering firelight. She could see the vulnerability beneath his warrior's strength, the healed-over wounds that she had, without knowing it, helped to mend. She tightened her grip on his hand, her own answer to his confession. He moved around the fire and knelt before her. He gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the line of her jaw. He was a man of few words, and his touch said everything his tongue could not. It spoke of respect, of admiration, of a deep and abiding affection that had grown slowly, like a great tree. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of sudden passion, but of profound recognition. It was soft and searching, a question and an answer all in one. It tasted of wood smoke and the clear, cold air of the mountains. In that single, gentle touch of lips, she felt the last of her old life fall away. She was no longer Sarah Jane Coulter, the outcast, the victim. She was here, in this moment, a woman grown, choosing her own destiny. When the kiss ended, he rested his forehead against hers, their breaths mingling in the quiet lodge. It was a moment of perfect, fragile peace. A few days later, as the sun was setting, Kwahu came to her, not as a friend in the quiet of the evening, but as a man with a formal purpose. He stood before the entrance of her lodge, and his stance drew the attention of those nearby. He was not dressed for the hunt. He wore a clean buckskin shirt adorned with quill work, and a single, perfect eagle feather was tied in his long, black hair. He did not ask her to come out. He simply waited. Sarah emerged from the lodge, her heart knowing what was coming. He did not speak of love in the way her people did. He spoke of deeds, of responsibilities, of a life he could offer. "I found you when you were left for the bears," he said, his voice clear and strong, "for all to hear. I have protected you on the trail. I have brought meat to this lodge, so you would not hunger. I stood with you when your old life came with guns, and I honored your choice. My hands are strong. My aim is true. My heart is loyal to the people, and it is loyal to you." He looked her directly in the eye, his face serious and open. "Sarah Jane, will you share my fire? Will you join your life with mine and make this lodge our home?" It was a proposal, Comanche style, a declaration of his ability to be a husband, a partner, a provider. Before she could answer, a figure detached itself from the crowd of onlookers. It was Stands in Storm. In her arms, she carried a large, beautifully woven blanket, its patterns telling a story of the sky and the earth. Her face, once so hard and unforgiving, was now softened with a deep, maternal warmth. She came and stood before them both. "My sister's spirit is at peace," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "She sees that the man she loved has found his heart again. It is time for a new song to be sung in this lodge." With a grace that was almost ceremonial, she draped the heavy blanket over both their shoulders, pulling them together under its warmth and weight. It was a blessing. It was her forgiveness. It was the full and complete acceptance of the entire community, embodied in the gesture of the woman who had once been her harshest judge. Sarah looked at Kwahu hot, his eyes shining, and she spoke the single word that was her future. Yes, they were married in the full blush of spring, when the wildflowers carpeted the valley floor. The entire village gathered in the great circle. The air was filled with the sound of a steady, rhythmic drumbeat and the smell of roasting buffalo. Chief Iron Path stood before them, his presence lending a solemn gravity to the joyous occasion. He spoke of family, of community, of the responsibilities they now had not just to each other, but to all the people. He spoke his words first in the Comanche tongue, for his tribe, and then he repeated them in slow, careful English, for Sarah. "A man and a woman alone are two single threads," he said, his voice resonating in the clear air. "But when they join, they become a rope to hold on to in the storm, a rope to pull the people forward. Today, you make a new rope, make it strong." As the ceremony ended, Sarah stood beside her husband, wrapped in the wedding blanket, the warmth of the central fire on her face. She looked at Kwahu hot, at his strong, kind face, the eagle feather in his hair a testament to his honor. She was no longer a woman between two shores. She was home. Life settled into a deep and peaceful current, like a river finding its true course after a flood. A full year passed, marked by the turning of the seasons, the successful hunts, and the quiet joy of a shared life. Sarah's belly grew round with the promise of a new generation, a child who would be a bridge between two worlds. Her lodge, once a place of borrowed safety, was now a home, filled with the scent of her cooking and the sound of her humming the Comanche lullabies Stands in Storm had taught her. She and Kwahu hot had built a life not just of love, but of profound partnership, their days entwined in the work and rhythms of the village. It was in the late summer, when the wild plums were heavy on the branches, that the scouts brought troubling news again. A new group of settlers, a small train of 3 wagons, had come up from the south. They had not come with the aggression of Fletcher's men, but with the quiet determination of families looking for land. And they had made a mistake. They had stopped and begun to build their cabins in the sacred valley of the Painted Stones, a place reserved for spiritual journeys and the burial of honored elders, well within the boundaries of the treaty lands. The mood in the village was somber. The memory of the last confrontation was still fresh, but this felt different. This was not an invasion. It was a trespass, likely born of ignorance rather than malice. Chief Ironpath convened a council, his face grave. He knew that a single misplaced act of violence could ignite a war that would consume them all. "This is a delicate matter," the old chief said, his eyes moving around the circle of warriors. "Their maps are full of lies, and their hearts are full of a hunger for land they do not understand. We must speak to them, but the words must be chosen with care." His gaze finally settled on Kwahu Hat, and then on Sarah, who sat beside her husband. "The two of you will go. You, my son, will speak with the heart of a Comanche, of the spirits and the bones that sleep in that ground. And you, Sarah Jane, will speak with the tongue of their own people. You will read their papers and show them the truth in a way they can understand. Go and make peace. It is harder work than making war." They prepared for a different kind of journey. Instead of weapons, they carried gifts, smoked salmon, bundles of sweetgrass, and a beautifully beaded pouch of tobacco. Sarah took the worn, creased treaty document that the chief kept, a paper filled with legal words she now understood all too well. It was a long day's ride to the Valley of the Painted Stones, and she felt the weight of her unborn child with every step of her horse. They found the settlers in a state of exhausted but hopeful industry. 2 rough log cabins were half built, the clean, pale wounds of the axe mark stark against the ancient landscape. Women were washing clothes in the sacred stream, and children were chasing each other through grasses that had never before been trampled by such games. They were a family, a small community of about a dozen people, led by a gray-bearded man named Elias Thorne, whose face was a map of hardship and worry. When they saw Kwahu Hat and Sarah approach, the settlers' hands went to their rifles, their faces tensing with fear. But Kwahu Hat raised his open palm in the sign of peace, and Sarah called out in clear English, "We have not come to fight. We have come to talk." Elias Thorne stepped forward, his own rifle held loosely, his eyes wary. The negotiations began there, in the shadow of the half-built cabins. They were long and painstaking, stretching over 2 full days. At first, the settlers were defensive and stubborn. "We were told this land was open," Elias insisted, unfolding his own crude map. The agent back in the territory drew the line right here, south of this river. Sarah took out the chief's treaty. She laid it on a flat rock between them, the official seal of the government, a stark symbol of promises so often broken. She traced the lines with her finger, her voice patient and calm. "Your agent was wrong, or he lied. You can see here, the boundary is the Crooked Ridge. 10 miles to the south. This valley, the stream, all of this is Comanche land, promised by the same government that sent you here." Her words, spoken in their own language, backed by the authority of their own documents, began to erode their certainty. But it was Kwahu Hat who spoke to their hearts. He did not speak of lines on a map. He spoke of life and death. "You have cut down trees that were old when our grandfathers were born," he said, his voice a low, respectful rumble. "The woman who washes her clothes in that stream disturbs the water where our young men come to seek their visions. The ground where you dig your foundations is the final resting place of Running Wolf. A chief so great his name is still a song among our people. You are building your homes on our church. You are planting your crops in our graveyard." He spoke for a long time, telling them the stories of the valley, of the hunts that sustained the tribe, of the spirits that resided in the painted stones. He was not threatening them. He was teaching them. He was showing them the soul of the land they had so casually claimed. By the evening of the 2nd day, the settlers' defiance had given way to a weary understanding. They were not evil people. They were desperate people who had been misled. They saw the truth in Sarah's papers and felt the power of Kwahu Hat's words. "We have nowhere else to go," Elias said, his voice heavy with defeat. "We spent everything we had to get here. To move now, the winter will come before we can build again. We will starve." Sarah and Kwahu Hat looked at each other. They had come to an understanding without speaking a word. Peace was not just about avoiding a fight, it was about building a future. "You will not starve," Sarah said, her voice firm. "The land the treaty grants you, south of the ridge, is good land. There is water and timber. It is a long journey, but you will not make it alone." Kwahu Hot then made the offer that sealed the new treaty between them. "We will help you," he said. "Our young men will help you take down these cabins and move the logs. Our hunters will bring you meat to see you through the first season. You will be our neighbors, and a good neighbor does not let another's children go hungry." The settlers stared, stunned into silence by the generosity of the offer. They had come expecting a fight and had been met with a wisdom and a grace that shamed them. Elias Thorne looked at Kwahu Hot, then at Sarah, her belly round with new life. He slowly extended his hand. Kwahu Hot took it. A new treaty had been signed, not on paper, but with a handshake and a promise. The journey home was slow, a feeling of quiet triumph in the air. They had done it. They had turned a conflict into a partnership, but the long days of tense negotiation and travel had taken a toll on Sarah. As twilight began to fall, a sharp, sudden pain seized her, radiating from the small of her back. She gasped, gripping the saddle horn. Kwahu Hot was at her side in an instant, his face etched with concern. The pains came again, stronger this time. The baby was coming, now, here, in the middle of the wilderness, a day's ride from the village. Panic was a useless luxury. Kwahu Hot acted with the same calm efficiency he had shown in every other crisis. He helped her from her horse and led her to a sheltered spot, a small clearing protected by a crescent of ancient cedars. He built a fire, his hands swift and sure. He laid out their warmest robes, creating a soft bed for her. The night grew cold, the stars appearing like chips of ice in the black sky. The hours that followed were a trial of endurance. The pain came in great, crashing waves, and Sarah clung to Kwahu Hot's hand, his strength her only anchor. He was her rock, his voice a low, steady murmur, encouraging her, breathing with her. He wiped the sweat from her brow, gave her sips of water, and never once let her see the fear he must have felt. He was a warrior, a hunter, a diplomat, and now, in the deep silence of the wilderness, he was a midwife, his hands gentle, his spirit unwavering. It was a long, dark night of struggle, but just as the first pale hint of gray began to touch the eastern sky, the final, fierce battle was won. A new sound filled the clearing, a sound that cut through the exhaustion and the pain, the strong, lusty cry of a healthy child. Kwahu Hot carefully cleaned the baby, a beautiful, perfect girl, and wrapped her in a soft piece of deerskin. He placed her in Sarah's arms. As Sarah looked down at her daughter's tiny, wrinkled face, the first rays of the rising sun broke over the mountains, flooding the clearing with a clean, golden light. The child had been born with the dawn. After a long night of darkness and struggle, there was only one name for her. "Morning Sky," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with tears of joy and exhaustion. Kwahu Hot knelt beside them, his finger gently stroking his daughter's soft cheek. A look of such complete, unshielded love was on his face that it took Sarah's breath away. Later, as the sun climbed higher, he took a small, beautifully decorated cradle board from his pack, one he had been secretly making for months. As he carefully laced their daughter into it, Sarah noticed the ties. They were made from the same kind of strong, rawhide rope as the one she had tied to the lodgepole during the blizzard. The homeward thread, the line that had saved his life, was now being used to secure his child. The rope of survival had become the bond of family. The years flowed by, each one adding a new ring of strength and belonging to the life Sarah and Kwahu Hot had built together. The valley became the whole of Sarah's world, a place not of exile, but of deep and abiding peace. She was no longer just a teacher of English. She was a keeper of stories, fluent in both the Comanche tongue and the ways of her adopted people. The children she had first taught were now growing into young men and women, and they moved between the two languages with an ease that promised a different kind of future. Quahuhat's stature grew with the seasons. His wisdom, honed by loss and tempered by his love for his new family, made him a natural leader. Chief Iron Path, his own steps now slowed by age, came to rely on Quahuhat's counsel more and more. He became the voice of the people in the delicate negotiations with the settlers and the ever-encroaching world of the white man. He was known as a man whose word was as true as an arrow's flight, and whose mind could see both the line on a map and the spirit of the land it divided. News from that other world, the one Sarah had left behind, came rarely, carried on the tongues of the few traders who were trusted enough to pass through their territory. One summer, a trader named Silas, a man with a kind face and honest scales, brought news of Broken Creek. He spoke of it as a place already fading into a cautionary tale. The drought never truly broke, he said, sharing a pipe with the elders. The creek ran for a season, then slowed to a trickle again. The sickness came back, worse than before. The people's hearts turned hard and suspicious. They blamed each other. They blamed the sky. Most have moved on, chasing rumors of gold or greener pastures. The houses are empty, the windows like vacant eyes. The wind whistles through the church. It is a ghost town, dying from a sickness of the spirit. Sarah listened to the news from a distance, her hands busy mending a small shirt. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction. Not even a lingering sadness. It was like hearing of the fate of a stranger in a distant land. That part of her life was a story that had ended long ago. The girl who had been tied to a post was a ghost, too, and her memory held no power here. Her life was here, in the lodge that was now a bustling center of warmth and activity. It was a life filled with small, perfect moments. Her daughter, Morning Sky, was now a girl of 5. With her father's serious eyes and her mother's stubborn spirit. She would sit for hours at the knee of Stands in Storm, her small fingers learning the intricate art of beadwork, her head bent in concentration just as her great-aunt's was. Stands in Storm, whose heart had once been a fortress of grief, had found a new purpose. She adored the child, and she loved Sarah with a fierce, protective loyalty. She no longer called her by her name. She simply called her daughter. They also had a son, a wild, laughing boy of 3 named Daniel, after the father Sarah had lost so long ago. He was a whirlwind of energy, his bare feet constantly drumming against the earth as he chased dogs and butterflies, his joyous shouts echoing through the village. One evening, as the sun bled orange and purple across the western sky, Sarah and Quahuhat sat outside their lodge, watching their children. Daniel was chasing his sister in a dizzying circle, their laughter as bright and clean as the evening air. Stands in Storm sat nearby, a contented smile on her face as she watched them. The entire village was bathed in the soft, golden light. A picture of such profound peace it felt like a prayer. Quahuhat reached over and took her hand, his thumb stroking the calloused skin. He was looking at their children, at the home they had made, at the life that had grown from the ashes of both their pasts. Sometimes, he said, his voice a low, soft rumble, I think of that night, of the arrow in the dirt. I did not know that I was not just saving a life, I was saving my own. Sarah leaned her head against his strong shoulder, the familiar scent of wood smoke and leather a constant comfort. She watched Morning Sky stumble and fall, only to be helped up by her little brother, the two of them collapsing in a heap of giggles. She thought of the cold, hard ground of Broken Creek, of the rigid, fearful lines of the houses, of a people so afraid of the world they would sacrifice a child to it. And then she looked at the sweeping, gentle circle of the lodges around her, at the open, endless sky, at the family that had been forged not by blood, but by choice and courage and love. "Home is not a place," she said softly. The words a truth that had taken her a lifetime of pain and joy to understand. "It is a choice." He tightened his grip on her hand, a silent agreement. And so their story passed into the land. Among the settlers in the distant towns, the tale was told of the wild Comanche warrior who had stolen a white girl, a captive who had either been bewitched or had gone savage herself. Among the other tribes, they spoke of Gray Eagle, the man who had lost his family to the white man's plague but had found a new spirit. A white woman with a strong heart who had brought peace in her hands. The stories grew and changed with each telling, becoming a part of the vast, shifting mythology of the West. But the truth of the story, the real story, was not in the legends. It was in the quiet moments, in the laughter of two children, in the shared warmth of a wedding blanket, in the steady, enduring love of a man and a woman who had found their home not on a map, but in each other. Theirs was a future that was still fragile, as all futures in that hard and beautiful land were. But it was a future they had built together, one brave choice at a time. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe to my channel, Wild West Tales. Like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.